Pop quiz. What do Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Texas, New Mexico, California, and Colorado all have in common? Well, a lot of things on the surface, right? They're all states. They all probably have animals in them. But we're looking at something different, right? Because here's another thing they have in common. From July 15th to September 15th, each of these states will be part of a gigantic military exercise held by Uncle Sam on U.S. soil. In fact, one of the biggest in U.S. history. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about Jade Helm 15. Thanks for tuning in. So that's Matt behind the camera. I'm Ben. We're going to give Chuck Norris our guest spot today because we love Chuck Norris jokes, right? We have a few pretty good ones that we probably can't do on air in case he finds us. But also, Chuck Norris has written publicly with his concerns about Jade Helm 15. And here are the concerns in a nutshell. You will hear people saying that this is secretly a program to institute martial law. People have quoted Alex Jones as saying this. However, Alex Jones did come back and say that he did not think this was an immediate thing of a massive world power or world government takeover or even a federal takeover. He said this was a kind of incrementalism, meaning that these periods of state control will raise slowly by degrees. You can picture the metaphor or the old analogy rather of frogs slowly boiling in a pot. And we had a lot of requests via emails, via Facebook messages, YouTube comments to take a closer look at Jade Helm. And we found some interesting stuff, especially the rumor that these unused Walmarts were going to be staging areas or FEMA collection camps, and that there were underground tunnels. Well, I guess most tunnels are underground, but there were tunnels connecting these different facilities. And concerns about Jade Helm and what this program entails extend all the way to political officials. The governor, also Senator Ted Cruz, they both reached out to both the public of Texas and the people in the Pentagon, or I guess the public of the Pentagon, whatever. The point is, they said that they had been assured that this was not some encroachment upon the sovereignty or the citizenship or the constitutional rights of the average citizen there in Texas. However, there is this overwhelming concern and anxiety that things might not be exactly as they seem. And in a way, this is true. Now, is Jade Helm itself some sort of insidious attempt to take over parts of the U.S. piece by piece by piece? Probably not, because we've heard about it. It was on The Daily Show. It's kind of like a Ouija board, you know what I mean? Like, if there is a way to contact the dead, is it a mass-produced game made by Parker Brothers? However, there are disturbing things. We should say that out of those 7 states we just named, only 5 are going to be part of these active military operations, having soldiers and special forces assets on the ground. And according to official accounts, what they are doing is training for future overseas operations, because the terrain in these 5 states represents a lot of what military operatives find when they are fighting or involved in operations overseas. Essentially, you could say this is a dress rehearsal for a war. Well, a lot of people might object to that phrase, a dress rehearsal for a war. But the fact of the matter is that we see military exercises, not just by the U.S., but by pretty much every major world power on an ongoing, continual basis. And there are a couple reasons for this. First, they have to know the equipment works, because imagine needing a plane to fly and then finding out it doesn't when you're in the air. Second, they need to have their personnel trained. Right? And third, and for our purposes, maybe most interestingly, we will see military exercises start taking place in areas of global tension, right? They're at the Strait of Hormuz. Oh, it's time for a military exercise. Things aren't going so well at the parallel between North Korea and South Korea. Time for a military exercise. Russia and insert name of Western European country here, time for a military exercise. And we've used that iceberg comparison before. When you see most of the commonplace reports of this sort of stuff, you see the tip of the iceberg and not the big explanation under the water, beneath the surface, about why this stuff is occurring. Now, what really has people wary of Jade Helm 15 is that it is so large. There have been so many other domestic military exercises or espionage activities. You know, how do we role play and catch a spy, for instance? However, this is one of the first and only, as far as we know, publicly acknowledged thing to have this many people in this many places doing this many things. And we looked at some of the official sources, even PowerPoints, which you can find online, and they say things like, Jade Helm is a challenging 8-week joint military and interagency unconventional warfare exercise conducted throughout Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. This is a special forces kind of thing, and regardless of whether it's a group of people taking over a state, it is disturbing to think that the military might be conducting operations in your town, that you might receive a notice one day saying these people performing suspicious activities are working for us and it's just an exercise. Remain calm, deep breaths, carry on, or that there will be noise complaints, or that there might be people going around carrying blanks in their guns. And this has the population of these areas worried. At this point, the vast majority of U.S. news sources and the vast majority of the U.S. population doesn't think this is some kind of Red Dawn style takeover or some encroaching federal force squashing out the common man. However, the Texas State Guard was mobilized, and the Texas State Guard is a very interesting entity. It has no federal, oversight. The buck stops at Texas. So this alone, mobilizing this force, shows how widespread the anxiety and the concern is. Now, how will Jade Helm 15 play out? That is something we will not know until at least July 15th of this summer. So we're going to stay tuned. We'll hopefully be coming back to update it, and we will have some conclusive looks at it on September 15th. However, there's another piece of this puzzle, or piece of the larger context, that a lot of other reporting sources are failing to present. And it's this, that a military exercise on domestic soil, as disturbing and unsettling as it will be, pales in comparison to the military exercises occurring across the globe and going unreported. Just a quick statistic, for example, in 2014, there were 674 U.S. military operations on the continent of Africa. That is 2 a day on average the entire year. And where are they in the news?
America!
Jade Helm 15.
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 Jade Helm. Joining us now is Steve Quell. Thank you, Steve.
It's really nice to be on with you because Jade Helm, I think, needs to be put in the larger context. This is the first time in history that a 2-month-long operation is going to be focusing on the American public. We know that the same tactics that are being proposed for the exercise to take place between the hours of midnight and 4 or 5 in the morning is exactly what the special operations troops did prior to the bombing of Iraq and all of our different Middle Eastern ventures, whether it's Afghanistan. In other words, you move the special operations community in prior to an event. Now, remember, I want to take everybody back to Larry Greatwall in his book, No Place to Hide. If people remember, he was the one that penetrated the weather underground when Bill Ayers and 24 other elite from Ivy League trained schools were talking about the necessity in the early 70s of killing 25 million Americans, and prior to the killing of them, moving them into detention camps for re-education. Now, I know, David, that you've read his stuff, but here's the larger context. I think that people are being tied up with the events or the implementation of how they're going to round up people and kill them, and they're forgetting the idea that when Bill Ayers was making this comment, he was deadly serious. Now, I've just taken the population density at that point in history, moved it into our point in history, and the numbers I've heard from special operations, active duty generals in the past, contemporary military and intelligence agents, is they're up to 80 million to 100 million people. So I think if people put it into context, notice the change. Notice the change when Middle East terrorists became obviously embraced by this administration. Now, that's the context. I think that people have got to understand that context, David, because what we're talking about is not an exercise. When the local police are told to stand down and not respond to gunfire, by the way, it's a live fire exercise. When we've seen massive YouTube videos, you guys at Infowars.com have led the charge in showing all the videos coming into you from all over the country. People are now starting to get it. And the point that I want to really get across to everyone today, and thank you for taking this hour out of your time to interview me, is this. This is the full-scale implementation of the red, the blue, and the green list. The red list are people. Now, do you remember, David, and I'll let you obviously respond because that's just my intro, the days years ago when gun owners' homes are being GPSed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we warned about that. And we tried to get people to understand. I was literally in my front yard in right at a mountain community at the base of the mountains in Bozeman, Montana, when the guy came up with his GPS unit and his bicycle and came literally to my front door. And I watched. The reason I didn't challenge him at the time, I wanted to see. To the left of me were leftists, to the right of me were leftists, and I wanted to see if they even got GPS. Absolutely not, okay? So I watched. This is not a report. Well, we heard massive reports of that happening. And the deal that people have got to understand is this, that with the implementation of the red list, the blue list, and green list, that was given to me almost 20 years ago, actually before that, about how it would be implemented when they were ready to make their move by the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency who was murdered for the Western United States. So that wasn't just, quote, internet talk, and obviously that at that point the internet was just in its beginnings. But I think it's important that people have got to understand that this explains everything. It explains the Chinese, it explains the Russians, it explains the North Koreans, and it explains the assault coming on the United States from Mexico. Remember when we broke the story? I think Alex had me on to talk about the Chinese troops. You guys verified it below the border.
Yes.
And then the thing that people have got to understand is that this is the plan. So when I say don't lose track of it in perspective, I want to just make one sentence and I'll give it back to you. In No Place to Hide, I call him Great Wall, maybe it's Grath Wall, explains that the weathermen actually believed that they would be successful in overthrowing U.S. government and that with the help of the Cubans, Chinese, Russians, and North Vietnamese, they would occupy America. Now remember, this is during the Vietnam War. Americans would have to be re-educated in camps similar to what communists did in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other countries that they had taken over. And then here's one of the most chilling revelations. I asked, well, what, Great Wall speaking, well, what is going to happen to those people we can't re-educate that are diehard capitalists? And the reply is they'd have to be eliminated. So, David, that's the context of what we see. The American people, as Alex has pointed out, as you've pointed out, as the, going on day after day, hours after hours, have become the enemy. And now in the face of basically nuclear tension, and for the record, I used to write about nuclear weapons and their effects and during the Cold War years, and civil defense and all that stuff. So as I look back on the perspective, we have seen the absolute taking apart of our military, our top flag officers and generals fired, any battlefield experience, and we've seen complete redirection of funds from foreign enemies to the internal enemies. And I've read on the air the letter that was sent in those days by, I believe it was either Janet Reno or Napolitano to the Russians requesting their help and the foreign troops. So you can't deny it any longer. People used to poo-poo black helicopters. They used to poo-poo Russian troops, Chinese troops.
Well, of course,
I think,
exactly. We've had the article we put up over the weekend that Paul Joseph Watson and Alex Jones put together listing all the many times that they have defined who their domestic enemies are. It's not just what Larry Grathwohl was saying. We've been seeing this coming from the administration. We've been seeing it coming out of the military academies and other think tanks that are associated with the military. We saw it coming out of the MIAC report. When they define what their enemy is, when they come in and do things like the NDAA, and then they start having these training exercises like we saw in Fort Lauderdale, where it looks like they're actually implementing the NDAA, dragging people who are civilians down the street, taking them off in helicopters, marching them in single file with military guards on either side, putting them into white vans and driving them off. I mean, that's exactly what we would expect to see if they implement the NDAA. But of course, they told us, don't worry, we're not actually going to do that. I don't believe that they're not actually going to do it. I don't know when they're going to do it. But of course, as many people have pointed out, whenever there's been a massive false flag attack or whatever, they've had a drill that's going on exactly at the same time in the same way. We saw this with the 7/7 bombings in London and the subway bombings. These people came back the day or so after and said, well, isn't this amazing? We were running a drill in exactly the same place with exactly the same scenario at the same time this was happening. It happened with 9/11. They can always use that to keep the people who are compartmentalized to not understand what's going on. And then the mass public looks at this and says, well, yeah, this came out after the fact. But when we expose it before the fact, maybe this particular time, this won't happen. Maybe they will just do some kind of a training exercise. But we always need to be on the alert. Steve, you were talking about the fact that you're concerned that this is coming to the next step, coming to fruition in terms of a war against the American people, talking about Larry Grathwohl. You're talking about the red list, the blue list, and the green list. Break that down for the audience.
The red list are the primary target for the New World Order in the United States of America when the order is given. The lists already exist, and again, according to, and I want to make this clear, I cannot know this stuff unless people tell me. Just like Alex gets tips, you get tips, David. There are people out there that genuinely love their country. So that's how I got this. The red list are primarily firearms owners. They are constitutionalists. They are people who have been politically active in resisting the New World Order. And those are the people that are their targets. And let me make this clear. They're not coming to take the guns away. They're coming to terminate, exterminate, blow away the gun owners. Again, special operations teams are not sent in to take prisoners unless it's a high-value target for a later date. They basically are trained to go in and just obliterate, okay? Now, again, when I get told this by a four-star general, active duty, and by the way, you guys have more probably active duty spec ops and spooks in Austin than any other city in the United States of America. You probably know that. If you don't, I will tell you that. And the thing that's fascinating to me, David, is the red list basically goes down the first 30 days, okay? So let's say they've increased it to 60 days. Well, they're combining now two different events. Now, the system that's been set to communicate with law enforcement from the Department of Homeland Security is a pretty secure system now. They can lock out individual officers from being able to hear the general alerts. They can punish or they can terminate. Now, these are really hard statements for people to understand. Quick anecdote, 30-second version. Chief of detectives in a major metropolitan city heard me on, I think it was one of the interviews Alex and I were doing a couple years ago. He didn't think I was basically upfront with the information until a foreign observer was assigned. I told him what to look for. The foreign observer knew everything about his family, his children, when they went to school, how much money he made. He knew everything, and he rode along in the back of two detectives' cars. And the interesting thing is I got a call from the individual probably a week later, and he said, you're right, this is going down just exactly as you said. Well, I wasn't the originator of that. The blue list are law enforcement, National Guard, and anybody who's contributing to the execution and the takedown of the red list. 30 days to 60 days after that, those guys get wasted. Now, I don't know what word you would use, David, but they're murdered. They're killed.
Yeah.
Now, where have we seen that in history before? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, the Navy SEALs that got bin Laden, right?
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.
And so, as a matter of fact, before we went on this show, I was contacted by a Navy SEAL overseas, and he said, Steve, I cannot believe what's happening to the country I love and was ready to lay down my life for. He said it's like a pall, if you will. A blanket of darkness has settled over the country and people can't see. What's happened, David, is one of the things that I've really tried to do in talk radio and all the stuff I've written and the interviews I've done, 9,000 plus hours, is to get people to understand. You've got to understand the root of evil because everything else is an offshoot of evil. May I speak? I'll give you one more interview that took place recently with a personal friend of mine, known to me, who met with various generals, retired, former Green Beret, had a meeting with retired generals and high-ranking former enlisted men who were very concerned because the friend of mine that had the meeting was asked to come to the meeting because supposedly there was a Pentagon memorandum put out about some of the people in this country that they are forbidden to listen to. He happened to be one of them. Alex happened to be one of them. I happened to be one of them. Hawk happened to be one of them, and Doug Hagman happened to be one. There were two other guys that he couldn't remember their name, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and I don't know it or I'd tell it. Here's the issue. The issue is, David, that the American people must understand that the sheer placement of the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, troops on the streets, and everything else is indicative. Now, let's talk about Jade Helm, the name. May I do that?
Yeah,
The
sure.
Blues simply are the people that they go into re-education and are assimilated. They get to live, but they get to live as perpetual drones or techno serfs at the behest of the New World Order. The thing that is really critical for people to understand is that Jade Helm's name, Jade is always associated with China. It has nothing to do primarily with the Middle East. It has everything to do with the Far East. If I tell you the captain's at the helm, that means he's steering the ship. That means that he is the one who's in charge of the direction. One of the Chinese demands upon the United States government was the fact that they needed to disarm the American public. You remember that story when it came out that China absolutely demanded that the American public be disarmed?
Yeah, I remember that was kind of strange, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And there's always something behind that. It's kind of like when the UN came out and said, you need to shut down Colorado and Washington State. The federal government needs to shut that down because we have a UN drug treaty. And, of course, it was the UN that set up the schedule for the war on drugs 10 years before Nixon declared the war on drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what's important is everything's in a name. Now, look, it's not lost in the financial markets that China has amassed the world's largest gold hoard, and this has everything to do with the name Jade Helm 15. Obviously, 15 can relate to the year that it's going to be implemented, as in this year. China is going to make an announcement at some point, and we're seeing it with the AIIB Bank. We're seeing it with the nations abandoning former allies. It doesn't matter if it's Australia. Doesn't matter if it's Britain. It doesn't matter who it is. Everyone's going to China because basically it's a truism, a maxism in the world that he who has the gold makes the rules. One of the things the bankers have been able to do is to transfer the gold that was in the United States. It's irrelevant if there's anything in Fort Knox. I'm here to tell you that there's nothing there. The point being is that China, with its 30,000 plus tons of gold, by the way, the World Gold Council is totally inaccurate in the country's gold holdings, just they're wrong. Russia, for instance, has right now in excess of 10 to 15,000 tons of gold. So the point is, let me make this clear. Jade Helm may be the orchestration and the introduction of the Chinese yuan or renminbi in a gold-backed or commodity-backed form. At that point, the dollar will lose value almost overnight, if not become worthless. My guess is, just quick and dirty, it goes down 50% in a matter of days and then another 30%. Well, that's not going to make anybody happy in the United States. The point being is that the riots will be generated. Now, here's something people need to do. Go to the root of the problem. You'll understand the fruit and how it will be implemented. In order for the communist revolution to take place, they want to engender civil war. I've been saying that. Alex has been saying that. And by the way, obviously with the Mayak report and others, when the veterans were vilified, any man or woman who has served in this country, any official capacity, had to note that this man's military, and I've never been in the military, but that's what a lot of them call it, has changed so dramatically. And it's fascinating to me that even yesterday or the day before, I may be off a day, but the President of the United States has now declared they want to cut back the military pensions. At the same time, there's unlimited amounts of money to purchase billions of rounds of ammo, MRAPs, the police department who have been militarized. So here's what I'm saying.
When you're talking about that, Steve, I think it's very interesting that it was just last summer that the Pentagon announced that they were going to stop giving equipment to fire departments. This was something that they've been doing since right after World War II, giving equipment to small rural fire departments because they can't afford very much, and they're the ones who have to deal with the really large fires. And so they shut that down. It stayed shut down for about a month, but there was a lot of pressure from the firemen, from congressmen and senators. They got that restarted. But that was happening at the very same time they couldn't get enough equipment quickly enough into all these small towns for law enforcement. They only wanted to give equipment to people who had the power and the authority to arrest. That was going to be what they were going to do it for, not to the fire departments. They wanted to completely shut that down.
Well, and you're correct. So the point is that, in essence, all the fire departments, any authority figures that with the power to arrest, and by the way, everybody, as you know, has been given the power to arrest now, from IRS agents to remember when the Forest Service Rangers never wore weapons. I can tell you from watching them, I take a lot of photographs, and in the national parks, and now you would swear that you would declare freely. You can't believe how weighted down those guys are with weapons in their car, AR-15s and shotguns.
And of course, you shouldn't worry about the fact they got billions of rounds of hollow point bullets, which the military doesn't even use. You shouldn't even worry about that. As we got all the pushback, they would look at the small purchases for some of these organizations and say, well, that's just for target shooting. But it's $3 billion. They would take the very smallest ones and they would push back against that. But we won that fight. And I guess, Steve, the question is, we also had this fight about a year ago with them trying to start the war in Syria with a false flag sarin gas attack, trying to blame that on the appropriate parties so they could use that as a pretext for war. Do you think that because this has been exposed, has gone viral, and there's so much talk about it, do you think that they will just stand this down and it'll just be a training exercise? Not to say that they won't do this in the future, but don't you think that the very publicity that has come there might make them to stand down on this for the time being?
That's what I'm praying for, literally, okay? And I literally am asking the prayerful, believing Christians around the world to pray against this because, again, it's kind of like when in even the Old Testament times, David, when, the idea or the plan to murder all of God's people that, was taking place, God raised up somebody, whether it was the prophet Elijah who could read the king's thoughts while he slept on his bed. I think that when at least a covert operation gets exposed, that they have to rethink. And let me share this. These guys have supercomputers calculating every single step and every single response. They have algorithms. When I broke the story about algorithms, the mathematical, if you will, structuring of specific, assassination parameters and rating people on a different scale, they have their targets already gridded out. It is my prayer, it is my concern that enough people scream about this, that enough people go to the congressman, because I posted a couple weeks ago, do you remember the old miniseries America?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
You remember that the scene where the Russians come in under the guise of being, quote, national terrorists and kill all of Congress?
Yeah.
And the Russian is addressing? Well, isn't it interesting that, what was it, the senator from South Carolina made the statement that, Obama should have the right to basically do away with Congress. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, effectively, he has, hasn't he? I mean, he pretty much does whatever he wishes. He's not constrained by the Constitution, by laws. He's not constrained by Congress or their threats. I mean, they're saying now, he wants to do he wants to implement the UN's climate change treaty just by executive order. And the Republicans are saying, well, all these countries need to realize that we just may undo that. They know they're not going to undo anything.